He built an empire out of steel and silence. Then a car bomb took the use of his legs and nearly took his life. 8 months of isolation followed. 8 months of firing every professional caregiver who walked through his door. Damien Voss trusted no one, needed no one. Then came a woman who couldn't even keep her own car running, let alone her own life. Loud, chronically late, dead broke, and completely unimpressed by armed men in tailored suits. She was the only one who ever looked at him and didn't see a man in a wheelchair. She saw a man. The Honda Civic died 3 feet from the iron gates of the Lake Forest estate. Lila Brooks let her forehead fall against the steering wheel. "Perfect," she said, to no one. It was the kind of humid June morning that stuck scrubs to skin before 9 a.m. In the tote bag on the passenger seat sat 2 things she hadn't told a single soul about. An eviction notice, the date circled in red ink, and half a bagel she'd been rationing since dawn. $400 stood between her and the street. Her landlord's texts had stopped asking. They'd started threatening. She kicked the door open. Humidity hit her like a wall. Behind the iron gate stood 2 men in dark suits, holsters bulging under their jackets, watching her the way men watch something they haven't decided is a threat yet. "I'm here for the interview," she called, chin up, voice steadier than she felt. "The caregiver position, unless you 2 are the caregivers, in which case I'm walking into traffic." Neither man smiled. The gate opened anyway. 6 years in Chicago's emergency rooms had taught her how to read a room fast, how to tell a bad shift from a dangerous one before the first punch landed. None of it prepared her for the walk up that driveway. None of it prepared her for Ryland Pierce, 6'4", a scar tracing his cheek, patting her down at the front door like she might be carrying a weapon instead of hand sanitizer and a granola bar. Her pepper spray went into a lockbox, so did her keys. A folder sat on a hallway table, law firm letterhead, half covered by a guard's arm before she could get a real look at it. Paperwork for the house, she assumed. She thought nothing more of it. Then they left her alone in a library dark enough that she blinked twice before her eyes found him. He sat with his back to her, a wheelchair of matte black titanium, a heavy wool blanket across his lap, despite the room holding a comfortable 70 degrees. When he spoke, his voice was low and rough. Gravel dragged over stone. "I specifically requested the agency's senior representative. You breathe too loud, and your shoes squeak." She set her tote down on a leather chair with a thud. "Rubber soles, OSHA compliance, and I'm 20 minutes late because my car died at your gate. I'm not senior staff, but I need this job more than you need a quiet nurse." He turned the chair. Steel gray eyes moved over her with a clinical thoroughness that had nothing to do with attraction and everything to do with assessment. The coffee stain on her scrubs, the loose red bun collapsing at the crown of her head, the curves she'd stopped apologizing for years ago. He didn't look at her like a man deciding whether to pity her. He looked at her like a puzzle he hadn't solved. A crystal whiskey glass slipped from a trembling hand. It shattered against the floor, some nerve damage he clearly hated people noticing. Lila didn't flinch. She didn't reach for a towel. She stepped over the glass, walked straight to him, and pulled the wool blanket off his lap. His hand closed around her wrist, hard enough to whiten her knuckles. "What do you think you're doing?" She looked down without blinking, thin legs, a pressure sore just beginning to form near his heel, and didn't look away. "You're hiding under a blanket in a 70-degree room. If I'm going to work for a Mafia boss, I need to see what I'm actually working with. You missed a spot on your heel. That turns into a real problem in about a week if nobody treats it." The silence stretched long enough that she assumed she'd talked herself out of a paycheck. Then he let go. "You're hired." What Lila didn't know, what she wouldn't learn for weeks, was that Damien Voss had already read her personnel file 3 days before that interview. 6 years in a Level 1 trauma center, a supervisor's note calling her unshakable under pressure, difficult with authority. He hadn't wanted a nurse who'd be gentle with him. He'd wanted someone who wouldn't run when the walls came down. He just hadn't expected to like her. 6 weeks folded into each other the way weeks do when two people are learning the shape of one another without quite meaning to. Lila showed up most mornings 15 minutes late, broke exactly 1 water glass a week. Never once used the soft, sing-song voice nurses reserve for people they've quietly decided are broken. Rylan started leaving the good coffee out for her without being asked. Even the guards at the gate had stopped searching her bag by the 2nd week. Damien noticed all of it. He noticed the way she talked to him like a person who happened to use a wheelchair, not a wheelchair that happened to have a person attached. He noticed, too, that for the first time in 8 months, he was waiting for something in his day instead of just enduring all of it. Neither of them said any of that out loud, but something had already started in the space between a slammed blanket and a shattered glass, and neither of them yet understood how much was about to be asked of it. At 3:17 one morning, phantom pain tore through what nerve damage had left of feeling in Damien's legs, and he woke twisted in the sheets, jaw locked around a sound he refused to let out. Lila climbed onto the bed without asking permission and used her full weight to hold his legs still against the mattress.
"Breathe, Damien. I've got you."
It was the first time she'd said his name without Mr. in front of it. He gritted his teeth through the spasm, and when it finally passed, she kept talking. Nonsense about the 3 locked rooms on the 2nd floor she was dying to ask about, until he laughed. A real laugh, rough from disuse, the first one in 8 months. When she packed up to leave that morning, her tote bag tipped, and a small voice recorder clattered onto the floor. Damien stared at it like it might go off. "What is that?"
"Old habit," she said, picking it up. "From the ER. I worked nights with patients who got violent, and a recorder kept me covered if anyone ever accused me of something I didn't do. Your house has more guns in it than my last ICU had ventilators. I never stopped carrying it." He held out his hand. She hesitated, then gave it to him. He scrolled back through weeks of recordings until he found one from 6 weeks earlier, the week she'd started, the day the kitchen delivery ran late and every guard got pulled to cover the gate, leaving her alone in the pantry longer than usual. He pressed play. A voice neither of them expected filled the library. Victor Lang, low and certain, talking to someone just out of sight of where she'd stood restocking supplies. "The boss is weak now. The family needs new blood." Neither of them spoke for a long moment. Lila had been carrying evidence of a coup in her tote bag for 6 weeks without knowing what she had. The following week, at a sit-down with the capos, Victor said something close to the same thing to Damien's face, a comment about a man confined to that chair, having no business running an empire. Lila, doing stretches nearby at Damien's insistence, didn't stay quiet. She told Victor exactly what she thought of a man who'd never survived what Damien had survived, judging a man who had. Damien rested his hand on her shoulder, brief, quiet, the kind of gesture a room full of capos would notice without him needing to say a word. That same night, he called Rylan into the study alone. He hadn't mentioned the recording yet, not even to Rylan, but Victor's challenge in front of the other capos had planted something he couldn't ignore. "Watch him," Damien said. "Every call, every account, every stop he makes between now and whatever comes next. Quietly." Rylan didn't ask why. He never did. 3 days later, Damien tried to transfer himself from his wheelchair to the shower seat alone, the way pride told him he should still be able to. His hand slipped on wet tile. He went down hard against the bathroom floor. Lila was through the door before the sound finished echoing. She didn't gasp, didn't apologize for finding him there. She shut off the water, checked the angle of his legs with the same clinical calm she'd have used on any patient, and got him up in one coordinated movement, her shoulder braced under his arm. In the steam, with his guard worn down to nothing, they kissed. Unhurried,
but no less certain. 8 months of a man forgetting what it felt like to be touched without flinching. Neither of them spoke about it as she helped him back to bed, but as she reached to steady a nightstand drawer that had slid open in the commotion, a document slipped out and landed at her feet. It was a will, the ink still crisp, dated 4 months back, before she'd ever set foot in that library. Her eyes found the line before her brain caught up. Whoever held the title of primary caregiver at the time of his death would inherit a share of his estate. "You wrote this before you ever met me," she said quietly. Damien didn't deny it. "I read your file. I decided who I wanted in that role before I ever offered it to you. I just didn't tell you what came with it." Damien hadn't written that clause out of romance. He'd written it out of fear. A man who had survived a car bomb by inches had learned that loyalty bought with money was the only kind he trusted enough to test. Love, if it ever came, would have to prove itself against the exact temptation he'd built into that drawer. What he never accounted for was how much it would cost him to watch her pass the test, because now he owed her something rarer than money, and he had no idea how to hand it over. He didn't explain further that night, but for the first time when she reached for his hand, he didn't pull away. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand a few minutes later, an unknown number. One line, no name attached. "The nurse dies next if she stays." Lila didn't know yet that the recording sitting in Damien's desk and the will she'd just read were about to become two of the most dangerous pieces of paper in Chicago, or that Victor Lang had already decided she needed to disappear before either one mattered. Damien tested her loyalty with a will she never asked for before she'd even earned his trust. Fair test of character, or manipulation dressed up as love? Team fair / team manipulation? Drop your answer in the comments. 2 weeks after the kiss, Damien agreed to a neutral sit-down at the Drake Hotel on East Walton Place, the kind of meeting held in daylight so no one could claim afterward that anything underhanded had happened. He wore a charcoal 3-piece suit, the wool blanket folded over his knees more out of habit than necessity. Ryland stood a few feet behind his chair, watching the room the way he watched every room now. Lila waited outside in the black SUV, a medical bag across her lap. She told herself she was there in case Damien's tremor acted up during a long meeting. She didn't examine too closely why her hands kept finding the zipper of the bag and running along it like a worry stone. The first gunshot came without warning, shattering the restaurant's front window and sending a body crashing through the glass onto the sidewalk. Diners screamed and scattered. Damien found himself pinned between a concrete planter and his own chair, returning fire toward the alley where the shooters had already vanished. Inside the SUV, Lila heard a voice cut through the chaos. "Get the nurse! She's the new weakness!" She didn't wait to think it through. She dropped the medical bag, threw the door open, and ran 15 feet across open sidewalk while gunfire chipped stone inches from her heels, until she slid down beside Damien and pressed her body against his side. "Lila, get down!" She already was. Damien pulled her the rest of the way into his chest and turned his back fully to the gunfire, shielding her. A round caught him high in the shoulder. He didn't make a sound, just tightened his arm around her and kept his weapon trained on the alley. Lila didn't run toward danger because she'd stopped being afraid. She ran because 6 years of ER shifts had taught her that the moment you hesitate is the moment someone dies, and she'd built her entire sense of worth around never being the one who hesitated. Underneath that reflex was an older wound. A woman who'd spent her whole life being overlooked couldn't stand the idea of being safe while someone who finally saw her clearly bled out in the street. It wasn't recklessness. It was the one place she'd never once doubted who she was. In the middle of it, Lila recognized one of the men closing in, a face from her old ER rotation, a patient she'd once treated on a slow night years before any of this. She called his name without thinking. The half-second of hesitation it bought them was enough. Rylan came out of the alley behind him and ended the standoff before it could go any further. They regrouped in a safe house behind a garage in Pilsen. Damien's shoulder had soaked through the dressing by the time Lila got him seated on an old couch. Her hands were steady, the way they always went still the moment a patient actually needed her. "Why did you run out there?" His voice came out hoarse, almost accusing, like he still couldn't decide whether to be grateful or furious. She didn't look up from the stitches. "Because I'm your nurse, and because you're mine." He went quiet at that. When she tied off the last stitch, she handed him her phone instead of an explanation. She'd hit record the second she heard the first shot, the device running the whole time from inside the bag she'd dropped on the sidewalk. Every shouted name, every order, captured clean. Damien played it twice before setting the phone down and gripping her hand instead. For the first time in 8 months, he let himself feel the full weight of something he hadn't said out loud yet. He wasn't only protecting her anymore. He needed her to survive whatever came next. "You could have died out there," he said. "So could you," she said. "You didn't stay in the car either." He almost laughed, despite everything, the closest he'd come since the whiskey glass shattered on his library floor. But the moment didn't last. Somewhere across the city, a second crew was already being briefed on an address in Lake Forest, and the quiet surveillance Damien had put on Victor 2 weeks earlier was about to turn up something neither of them was ready for. The power cut at the Lake Forest estate at exactly 2:17 in the morning. Every camera feed died at once, and the house fell into a silence that felt deliberate rather than accidental. Lila was still awake in the reading chair by the window, a small lamp, the only light left burning in the house. She'd gotten into the habit of staying up until Damien fell fully asleep ever since the anonymous text 3 weeks earlier. She told herself it was nothing. Her body had stopped believing that days ago. It was the same feeling she used to get in the ER at 3 a.m., in the hour before a patient she'd flagged as fine, coded anyway. The hour she'd learned, at 19, sitting beside her mother's hospital bed, that quiet didn't always mean safe. Her mother had gone the same way, in a room this still, while everyone around her insisted there was nothing left to watch for. Lila had promised herself, somewhere in that hospital corridor, that she'd never again mistake silence for peace. So when the lamp flickered and the hallway monitor blinked to black, she was already moving before her mind caught up to why. She heard footsteps that didn't match Rylan's familiar gait, heavier, deliberate, spaced wrong. She was at Damien's bedside in seconds, one hand over his mouth, the other pointing at the dead monitor. He understood immediately. No questions, just the look of a man who'd lived through worse nights and knew exactly what came next. Lila reached beneath the mattress for the handgun he'd shown her months earlier, back when this had still felt like a precaution rather than a promise. She pulled him down behind the heavy bed frame, his back braced against solid wood, the lowest and most protected position in the room. Somewhere below them, a door groaned open on a hinge nobody in the house had ever oiled. 2 men in tactical gear came through the door, weapons fitted with suppressors. In the half-second before the first shot, Lila's eyes caught something small and out of place. A cufflink on the nearer man's wrist, dark metal, an insignia she didn't recognize and wouldn't understand the significance of until much later. She filed it away the way she filed away every strange detail in a trauma bay, without knowing yet which ones would matter. Damien fired twice from the floor, catching the first man in the leg and putting him down. The second lunged toward the bed. Lila swung a heavy silver cane she'd stashed on her side of the mattress weeks earlier and caught his wrist mid-reach. His gun clattered away, and he staggered back out of the room, boots skidding on hardwood, still slick from the housekeeper's evening wax. Then a third set of footsteps, unhurried, almost lazy. Victor Lang stepped through the doorway himself, Not in tactical gear, but in a sharply cut suit, a lit cigar between two fingers, the smoke curling gray against the one working emergency light in the hall. He hadn't sent men to do this alone. He wanted to see it happen. 8 months of being underestimated had built to exactly this moment, and he wasn't going to let hired men take it from him. "You can't even stand up to watch me finish this, Damien." Damien stayed exactly where he was, voice level, though Lila felt his pulse hammering where her hand still rested against his chest. "I don't need to stand to end you." He pressed a small button on a remote clipped inside his sleeve. Across the room, his 400-pound titanium wheelchair surged forward on its own power, pinning Victor hard against the wall and trapping his legs beneath its frame. Victor's breath left him in a sharp, winded gasp, the cigar falling from his fingers and rolling, still lit, across the floor. He didn't get back up, and for the first time all night, the smirk slipped from his face. Even pinned, he tried to hold on to it. "You think this stops anything? I planted that car bomb 8 months ago. There's a new order tonight. Kill the nurse in front of you before sunrise." That was when Rylan stepped into the doorway, a plain folder in his hand instead of a weapon. 2 weeks earlier, right after Victor had stood in front of the other capos and called Damien weak, Damien had quietly asked Rylan to start watching him. Rylan hadn't found a confession on tape. He'd found something harder to argue with. Wire transfers from a rival family's shell account into one of Victor's, timed 2 days before the car bombing 8 months earlier, and again the week before the ambush at the Drake. Rylan set the folder on the nightstand. He's been on their payroll since before the bombing. Every version of this, the bomb, the hotel, tonight. He already sold you out for a price. The room went still in a different way than the gunfire had left it. Victor's confidence cracked for the first time all night, not because he was pinned, but because the folder made his failure permanent, undeniable, the kind no charm could talk away in front of the family later. His hand, still resting against the wall for balance, trembled once before he steadied it, the same small involuntary give Lila had seen in 100 patients right before they stopped lying to her. Victor had spent his whole career believing contempt was the same thing as strength, that mocking a mafia boss who couldn't stand was proof he himself never would need to be pitied. What the folder exposed wasn't just a betrayal, it was the truth underneath the mockery. He hadn't attacked Damien's wheelchair because he believed it made him weak. He'd attacked it because some part of him understood that a man who could survive losing everything and still hold a room's loyalty was stronger than Victor had ever been, standing on 2 good legs. In the confusion, a stray round from the retreating gunman caught Lila's arm as she moved to shield Damien one more time. She went down onto one knee, blood already soaking through her sleeve, the copper smell of it hitting her before the pain did. Damien's face drained of color, the same helplessness he'd felt the night of the bombing, rising up whole and unwelcome, the same ringing silence he remembered from the seconds after the blast 8 months ago, when he'd woken up on the pavement and understood, before anyone told him, that his legs were gone. He said her name louder than he meant to, his voice cracking on the second syllable in a way none of the capos had ever heard from him. Victor, still pinned, managed one last line before Rylan hauled him out. "She'll bleed out for you, Damien. Same as you already did, 8 months ago." Nobody answered him. The house went quiet again, the kind of quiet that comes after something ends, though Lila, even light-headed, noticed it wasn't the same quiet as before. This one had a weight to it, like the whole house had exhaled at once. Damien turned to Rylan, his voice breaking on words he'd never said aloud before. "If she doesn't make it, I burn all of it down. The empire, the family, every name on Victor's payroll, all of it." Rylan didn't argue. He nodded once and reached for his phone to call a doctor who wouldn't ask questions, while Damien pressed a hand against Lila's arm and whispered her name like it was the only thing keeping either of them in the room. The house held its breath for the better part of an hour. Rylan paced the length of the downstairs hallway with his phone against his ear, voice pitched low, giving directions to a private doctor who kept his line open for exactly this kind of call. Two of the staff stood near the kitchen doorway, not speaking, one of them still gripping a dish towel she'd forgotten she was holding. Nobody turned on the overhead lights. It felt wrong to make the house that bright while Damien sat upstairs with Lila's blood drying on his hands. Gray dawn settled over Lake Forest by the time the doctor left. The blood had been cleaned from the floor. Lila lay in bed, her arm bandaged and immobilized, drifting in and out of a light sleep. Damien sat beside her in a spare wheelchair, his hand wrapped around hers, refusing to let go. For the first time in 8 months, he hadn't bothered to cover his legs with the wool blanket folded over the chair beside him. Lila's eyes opened slowly. "I'm still here," she said, her voice thin but steady. His eyes were rimmed red. "You didn't run." "I told you once," she said, a faint, tired smile pulling at her mouth. "I'm not senior staff, but I don't run either." He reached into the nightstand drawer and pulled out the same document she'd found weeks earlier. "I want to explain this properly before you read it wrong a second time. I updated this 4 months ago, right after I read your file, before I ever offered you the job. I didn't know you yet. I only knew what your file described, and I made a bet that whoever took that role would be someone who couldn't be bought or scared off. I left it in that drawer as a test. If you'd found it sooner and used it, I would have understood, and I would have let you go without a word. You found it, and you didn't take a thing. You told me the truth about it instead." She looked at the document a long moment, the morning light catching the crease where it had been folded and refolded. "My mother spent the last year of her life in a bed like this one," she said quietly. "I used to sit with her and listen to nurses talk about her like she wasn't in the room. I told myself if I ever became one, I'd never do that to anybody. I didn't take care of you for a piece of paper, Damien. I did it because I know what it costs a person to be looked past." He didn't answer with words. He just tightened his grip on her hand until she felt it in her bone. Over the following days, as her arm healed enough to move without wincing, something in the house settled into a rhythm neither of them had expected. She teased him about the coffee the kitchen staff now kept stocked without being asked. He caught himself, more than once, asking Rylan for help lifting something instead of trying it alone first. A small thing, but not a small thing at all, for a man who'd spent 8 months hiding a blanket over his legs rather than ask anyone for anything. When she was strong enough to stand for a few minutes at a time, she asked him to wheel her out to the terrace. There, with the morning wind coming off the lake, she took the will from his hands, struck a match, and let the paper burn to ash in an old ceramic dish. "I don't want the estate," she said quietly. "I don't want a title or a number in a will. I want you. The wheelchair, the enemies, the mistakes you've made, all of it. I'd choose it again tonight if I had to." Damien pulled her hand to his chest. "Then you should hear the rest of it from me directly, not from a piece of paper. From now on, you're not on payroll. You're not a caregiver. You're my equal in every decision this family makes." That evening, once she could stand on her own for a few minutes, Damien called the remaining capos into the main hall, the loyal ones, and a few who had quietly wondered, over the last several months, whether loyalty to a mafia boss in a wheelchair was worth keeping. The hall smelled faintly of the cigars some of them had smoked while they waited, and the old floorboards creaked under the weight of a dozen men trying to look like they hadn't been nervous for the last 6 hours. One of the older capos, a stocky man named Salvatore who'd served Damien's father before him, kept his eyes on Lila's bandaged arm the whole time, saying nothing, his jaw working like he was chewing on a thought he wasn't ready to speak aloud yet. Damien didn't put a hand on her shoulder this time, the way he had after the first challenge weeks earlier. He took her hand fully, in front of every one of them, and said the words plainly. "Anyone who comes for her comes for me first. She is not staff. She is not a guest in this house. She is my partner, and this family answers to both of us from tonight forward." No one argued. A few of the older capos exchanged glances Lila couldn't fully read, but none of them spoke against it. Not after watching over the last 2 months exactly what she'd been willing to run toward instead of away from. Victor Lang heard the news secondhand from one of Ryland's men while he lay in a guarded room with both legs splinted, waiting to be handed over to people even less forgiving than Damien. He said nothing back. A man who'd spent his whole career mocking anyone who couldn't stand on his own 2 feet had finally been undone by the 2 people in Chicago he'd underestimated the most. Outside the estate walls, word of the failed hit had already reached further than either of them realized. The family that had been funding Victor from the start hadn't lost their appetite, only their inside man. For now, they watched from a distance, patient in the way only people with more resources than urgency could afford to be. Neither Damien nor Lila knew that yet, standing in that hall with her hand still bandaged and his grip steady around hers. For one evening, at least, the doors were locked and the 2 of them were still standing, together, on whatever terms they'd chosen for themselves. A few nights later, Damien sat by the tall window overlooking the garden, and Lila settled beside him, her bandaged arm resting carefully in her lap. The house had gone back to its usual quiet, the kind that no longer felt like the silence before something bad happened. The heavy wool blanket that had covered his legs for 8 months sat folded on a chair across the room, untouched since the morning she'd found the will. The wheelchair beside the bed hummed faintly as he adjusted its position. A tool now, the way a cane or a pair of glasses is a tool, not the cage it had felt like for so long. "You were hired to take care of a Mafia boss who couldn't stand," Damien said. "You ended up doing something none of my own family managed in 8 months. You made this whole house understand that the most unpredictable person in it was also the strongest one." Lila smiled, tired but steady. "That's because you stopped needing anyone to feel sorry for you. You just needed someone to actually look at you." They sat like that a while, her head against his shoulder, his hand over hers. When they finally kissed, it wasn't like the kiss in the bathroom, or the one after the hotel. Not adrenaline this time, not pressure. Slower. The kind of kiss that comes after a storm has actually passed, instead of in the middle of one. "I used to think strength meant never needing anyone," Damien said, looking out at the dark garden. "Every year in this life, I built more walls, trusted fewer people, told myself that was what kept me alive. Then I ended up in this chair and couldn't hide behind any of it anymore. For a while, I thought that made me weak. It took almost losing you to understand it was the opposite." "What changed your mind?" she asked. "You did. The night you pulled a blanket off my legs and told me I'd missed a spot instead of pretending not to notice." He turned to look at her fully. "Real strength was never about standing on my own. It's about who's willing to sit on the floor with you and stay there, even when staying costs them everything they thought they wanted instead." Lila tightened her grip on his hand. "And you found that person." "I did," he said. "Took her long enough to believe it about herself." Down the hall, Ryland checked the restored security feed one more time before turning in. Feeds doubled since the attack, watched now by men Damien trusted with more than just his life. Staff who'd quietly underestimated Lila for 2 months now knocked before entering a room she was in. The kitchen kept her coffee order on hand without being told twice. None of it undid what Victor had cost them, or the threat still gathering somewhere beyond the gates. But for one night, in one room, none of that weighed as much as it had a week earlier. Damien looked out at the Chicago skyline glowing faint on the horizon, his voice low but sure in a way it hadn't been in a long time. People used to be afraid of me because of what I could do to them. I don't think anyone's ever going to be afraid of you, he said. But they'll remember you, every one of them, for the rest of their lives, whether they want to or not.
I'll take that,
Lila said, and rested her head back against his shoulder, watching the same skyline he was. The story that began with a Honda Civic dying at an iron gate had turned into something neither of them could have predicted the morning Lila walked up that driveway with an eviction notice folded into her tote bag. A mafia boss the world had quietly written off, and a nurse the world had never fully noticed to begin with, had found in each other exactly what neither of them had been looking for. This story reminds us that quiet strength rarely announces itself and often looks, from the outside, like someone simply refusing to leave. If you've buried a spouse, or you're sitting in a house that used to be full and now just echoes, you already know something Lila had to learn the hard way. Showing up for one hard moment matters more than showing up perfectly. So if there's a neighbor who lost their husband last spring, don't wait for the right time to call. Bring over a casserole this week, sit at their table for 20 minutes, and let the silence be comfortable instead of avoided. If your grown kids never call, try picking up the phone yourself this Sunday instead of waiting for them to remember. And if you're the one who feels invisible in your own family the way Damien did in that chair, say the specific thing you need out loud to one person you trust, instead of hoping someone eventually notices on their own. Real repair usually looks smaller and more ordinary than the movies make it look. A phone call, a shared meal, an honest sentence. It rarely looks like a rescue. It looks like someone deciding to stay in the room. What did you think of Lila's transformation? From an overlooked caregiver nobody took seriously to a woman who refused to back down when it mattered most. Tell us in the comments below. And if this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more.